Good evening to all Slovenes and to all the Europeans, and good afternoon to Americans. We finally meet. I know I promised you the interview with famous and to some infamous Derrick Derrick Jensen 2 days ago, and now we finally meet. It was my fault and a bit the fault of I don't know misunderstanding the differences in time. Derrick, it's a great honor. Thank you for accepting my invitation.
Oh, well, thanks for inviting me.
The most quote unquote reliable platform on the planet Earth describes you, Derrick, as an American eco-philosopher, radical environmentalist, and anti-civilization advocate. Um, what would you say is what are you first of all?
Well, at the risk of being too precious, I'm a human animal. Uh, but among those categories, I self-describe as a writer and activist, uh, and I'm not unhappy with that. I can live with anti-civ activist and environmental activist. Um, yeah, so that's okay.
Um, what how would you describe what what anarchism as an ideology is or was or is to you in and how is it different towards the the fact that it's gone astray to its roots at least.
Well,
Or would
it's
you say or sorry, or would you say the roots have been these have been the roots from the beginning on?
Well, it's a really interesting question, and one we could spend the entire hour discussing easily. I wrote a book a few years ago that never got published, and in fact cost me my publishers at the time. And the book was about how there is really a war for the soul and direction of anarchism, and that conflict consists of, on one side, you have just a second. I wonder if I should get headphones or something because I'm getting, okay, the echo is gone.
Okay.
I'm getting a little bit of an echo.
I don't think it's coming from my side.
Okay, I'm going to try headphones and see if that helps.
Cool.
Sorry about that.
No problem.
Okay, can you hear me still?
Yeah, I can still hear you.
Okay, great. I can't hear the echo anymore.
Okay, cool.
Turn this down a little bit so I don't deafen myself. Okay, so there's been a conflict for the sort of soul and direction of anarchism. And on one side, you have a lot of anarchists who have the really basic understanding that governments are set up primarily to serve those in power and others of their class. And that's a lot of the classic anarchist position. You know, that would be probably Chomsky's argument and Edward Abbey's argument and some of the anarchists that would probably be Kropotkin's argument. And I used to do a lot of talks, and there would be, I asked literally tens of thousands of people over about 10 years, do you believe that governments take better care of human beings or corporations? And there was not a single person all that time said that governments take better care of humans than corporations. Everybody knows that governments take care of corporations. And we can talk about the reasons for that, which I think are pretty fascinating. But the point is that on one side, you have people like that who understand But yeah, governments will make some laws to. They also make laws to protect people from various threats, but their primary purpose, or one of their primary purposes, is to make the trains run on time and to make the economy to facilitate the running of the economy. And then on the other side of this conflict, you have those who believe that because the rules, because governments exist primarily to serve those in power, therefore, all social rules are inherently oppressive and must be done away with. And I find that completely appalling. And so that latter half leads to such insanity as there have been strains of anarchism that strongly promote pedophilia, because all social rules are inherently objectifying and inherently oppressive. Therefore, we must do away with all social constraints whatsoever. This is how you can have the magazine Anarchy, a journal of desire armed, actually ran entire issues devoted to promoting pedophilia back in the 90s. And you can have, this is a strain that goes back through anarchism. And that's where we get the question of, is this anarchism has gone astray, or is this a problem that goes to the root of anarchism that starts at the beginning? And I argue in the book that these strains have been fighting for thousands of years. And if you want, we can go back to Diogenes and discuss Diogenes and Antisthenes and show how they are directly in line with the side of anarchism that I think is very harmful, and queer theory, how they fit in with Antisthenes and Diogenes. And I know somebody who has this great line about how history is the same characters, just different uniforms, and how there are some strains that run through that have been destructive for a long time. Anyway, so what is anarchism? On one hand, it's the understanding that humans are capable of self-determination, and humans are capable of governing themselves and having a governing system that supports community and is not dysfunctional but functional, and serves the needs of the people in the community. And then on the other hand, you have strains of anarchism that do everything they can to show exactly the opposite, that humans are not capable of self-governance.
Well, it seems that what you're saying right now, it implies that there's something artificial about modern governments. What would it be that it is artificial about them? Because on the other hand, I wanted to ask you, were there ever any societies, even little tribes or whatever units we would choose, that were without any governments of some sort?
Well,
communistic societies, in sort of say.
Before I answer that, please define government. How are you defining government?
Some people of the society are being put in function to govern that society. And that's then being called a government. So I would consider kings to be some sort of government too, not only modern liberal democratic governments. Yeah.
Well, I think a couple things. One is there's a pretty interesting number called Dunbar's number, which is about 120 or 150, which is the number beyond which you can't have direct decision-making processes. If you have 10,000 people, you have to have some other if you have 100 people in a group, you can have processes whereby the decision-making processes are you're able to hear everybody's voices. You don't have to have some sort of representative government. But if you have 10,000 people, you can't have everybody contributing, because we are not capable of handling all of those relationships. We don't know all the interactions. And so there have been small groups, but does that mean they have no form of governance? That's the thing. I remember I was taught how to hunt by some very experienced hunters back when I was in my early 30s. And when we would go out hunting, when we're in the truck on the way out to where we would go, we were all equal. But when we got out of the car and they handed me a gun, I did what they said, because they were experts and I was not. And so is that ends up being, is that a form of governance? There has never been a human community that didn't have some form of authority, because children do stupid things. I mean, that's part of what it is to be a child, is you are taking risks. I mean, I had this idea when I was about 6 or 7 that it would be a good idea to jump off the roof, because I saw people do it in movies, and they could jump off a roof and they would land and roll and then get up and run. And fortunately, I landed hard, but I didn't hurt myself. But children do stuff like that. And Noam Chomsky talks about how if he were walking with his grandchild, presumably great-grandchild now, and the grandchild started to run into the road, he would not only use his authority to hold the child back, he would coercively do it by grabbing the child and physically restraining the child to keep the child from running into the road. So you do need some form of decision-making processes, and there exist people who have more experience than others, and whose opinion should be valued more on that particular issue. Like I said, when we went hunting, I was completely inexperienced, and they would say, we want you to go sit over there and wait and see if any deer come out, and we're going to go over here and do whatever we're doing. And I listened to them because they knew what they were talking about. And so is that considered a form of government? But then we get into another really interesting thing, which is, and I talk about this a lot, and I think it's really important, I don't think anarchists talk about it enough, is Lewis Mumford's idea of the mega machine. And what that is Lewis Mumford proposed, and I agree, that the most important human invention was not the lever or the screw or the bow and arrow, but instead the most important human invention was what he called the mega machine, which is a machine composed of interchangeable human parts. And what he means by that is the top-down bureaucratic military-style organization that is also the governing organization. And the one reason that is so important, and neither one of us is saying it's good, we're both saying it's important, is because humans are fundamentally contentious, I think. And, we pick at each other, and we have Dunbar's number that only 120 people can sort of get along. And beyond that, you're going to form subgroups. And how are you going to create a construction army that's going to create pyramids, which not coincidentally are giant tombs, or to sell Coca-Cola, or to invade Russia, or to make trains and have them run on time? How are you going to get people to do that? And it's through these top-down bureaucratic style organizations. And that has allowed those who come up with them to conquer other places, it's a tremendously useful tool and a tremendously destructive tool, both to humanity and to everything else. And one of the things that the reason I bring this up in terms of anarchism is another bit of Lewis Mumford I think is really important, is he talks about technics, Technics, and that is the combination of social form and technology. The technologies don't arise out of a vacuum, and certain technologies arise from and give rise to certain social forms. And, excuse me, he broke those into democratic and authoritarian techniques. And so, for example, pottery would be a democratic technique because anybody can do it. Nobody can control your access to mud or clay. A bow and arrow would be a democratic technique because nobody can control your access to a piece of wood, a piece of string, and another piece of wood for a rudimentary bow. There can be people who are better at it or worse at it, but it doesn't require those authoritarian structures. And on the other hand, anything that requires mining requires that you have a military to conquer the land because somebody else lives on that land where the mine's going to be. It requires a police force because nobody wants to go into a mine. And then it requires a police force in order to keep people from stealing the ore once you've smelted it, or once you've made the metals. Somebody's going to try to steal it, so you have to have a police force. So anything with mining requires that. And I'll give an example, and then I'll shut up and you can do another question. Several years ago, I was getting interviewed by this guy who was a dedicated Marxist who believed that it was possible to have an industrial system based purely on voluntary exchanges and no exploitation whatsoever. And he ignored the land. He didn't care about the land at all. Anyway, so I said, great, do you have cities? And he said, yes. I said, how do you get around in your cities? He said, on buses. I said, what are the buses made of? And he said, metal. I said, great. Where do you get the metal? He said, mines. I said, great. Who works in the mines? And he said, well, people. And I said, so how do you get people to work in the mines? Because mining is such a miserable existence that it was one of the first forms of slavery. So, well, you pay them a lot. And I said, well, I'll give you that one. But what do you do about the fact that every hard rock mine on the planet has polluted nearby groundwater? They inevitably pollute it. And he said, well, you just pay the people to leave. I said, what if they won't leave, no matter how much you pay them? It's you pay them more. I said, well, what if they have lived there for 5,000 years, their ancestors are buried there, and they refuse to leave their ancestors? He said, how many of them are there? And I said, what difference does it make? Let's say there's 500. He said, well, the 1 million people in the city vote, and they vote that those 500 people have to be kicked off their land. And I said, so you've moved from purely voluntary exchanges, no exploitation, to land theft from indigenous people, genocide. Also, you can have a bus, and all in less than a minute. And the point is that a city will demand certain forms of living, demand certain social structures. So I know Bob Black, who is, I don't know him personally, thank goodness. Bob Black argued that, and he said he was making a joke, but he never presented a real answer. He argued that the way you deal with sewage treatment plants in cities is that children like to muck around in the mud and dirt. So you just have children go in to work your sewage treatment plants, and that's how you deal with sanitation in a city. And that's completely insane. A, it's child labor. B, that is a recipe for a cholera epidemic. So the point is, if you're going to have 6 million people living in one metropolitan area, that means you're going to have a sewage treatment plant, or you're going to have cholera, one or the other. And if you have a sewage treatment plant, that means you have to have people working in it, which means you have to have a wage economy, which means you have to have all the things that come with it. So to finally answer your question, have there ever been any places that didn't have a government? I'm going to switch it over. Have there ever been any places that didn't have a mega machine? Yes. Have there ever been any cities that didn't have a mega machine? No. So I answered a slightly different question.
So if civilizations come out of cities, doesn't that imply that you'd have to have this small type of communities with awareness of this fact, and the awareness of this fact would imply that you'd have to um, take care of cities not to evolve? Wouldn't that imply? And how would you do it? How would you do it? This is the most important question.
Well, the problem is that, well, there's a bunch of problems. One of them is that cities are inherently unsustainable because as your city grows, you'll denude an ever larger area of resources that you take into the city. Where do you get your bricks? Where do you get your wood? I mean, the first written myth of Western civilization is Gilgamesh deforesting the hills and valleys of Iraq in order to build a great city. And that's the story of civilization right there. And the problem is that once you have agriculture, which we can talk about if you want or not, once you have agriculture and civilization, you're destroying your land base, but you're also growing more humans. And you're also converting the productivity of the land that makes trees and wolves and elephants, depending on where you are, makes all these other animals. You're converting that all to human use, to human livestock, to humans, and to weapons of war. And one of the problems is that because your way of life is not sustainable, you have to keep conquering other places or collapse. From the perspective of civilization, that's the bad news. The good news is, from the perspective of civilization, bad news for everybody else, is that you now have a competitive advantage. So let's say you have a culture here that leaves their land the way it is, and they just live off what the land gives them willingly. And this culture right here, right next to it, has converted it all into weapons of war and into additional humans who can become a standing army. Which one is going to win if they have a conflict? The one with the standing army and the war and the weapons of war. So the problem is that when a peaceful culture runs up against a culture that is hell-bent on expansion, that peaceful culture has a choice. They can either become warlike themselves, or they can surrender, or they can run away. And running away usually involves running into somebody else's territory because somebody else already lives there. And we saw this a lot in the conquest of North America, and presumably the same thing happened in Europe at the time of the Romans, where people would flee the approaching army, and people as a whole, not just individual refugees, but communities would up and move because they don't want to fight. And then, of course, they're moving into their neighbor's territory, and they don't want them because the land can support them. It can't support two of them. And so it leads to just this expanding wave of conquest. We saw the same thing too. This was one of the problems that caused severe difficulties for the Roman Empire, was that when, for example, the Huns invaded, the Huns not only invaded themselves, but they pushed waves of peoples in front of them who then were invading the Roman Empire. So once the process starts, it is metaphorically highly infectious.
Mm. What I wanted to ask you, I know that historically anarchism hasn't been very fond of church, yet I remember from the church's social teaching, and I know that church itself hasn't been um, very consistent about it. But Church's social teaching has had these two principles. Um, Subsidiarity and solidarity, for example. And subsidiarity means that basically the preference of the most local as possible. Um, so for example, if you take Slovenia, it's a small country and has two for our purposes big cities, Maribor and Ljubljana. And if for example Maribor can govern itself without the governance of Ljubljana, then it should, and so it goes to the lit list of the villages, if I'm understandable. Would you say that this is a sane mechanism that would be purposeful even to the anarchistic ideology?
Well, I understand anarchist resistance to much of the many of the organized churches because of the role that churches have played in maintaining states. I think we can all agree on that, right? That traditionally, the Catholic Church and the nation states all through Central Europe and all through, I mean, that the church was a major player in politics through I don't know, let's say 400 to 1800 at least. So we'd agree on that, right? And so we can see that anarchists would generally have a problem with that. But now I'm going to step away from that for a second and ask, what are some of the primary purposes of a religion? And if a primary purpose of a religion is to simply maintain the overarching social order, then I can see problems to it. But I think religions can have other purposes. And one purpose of a religion, in my perspective at least, would be to teach people how to get along with each other and to teach people how to live in place and to teach people how to experience the divine in that place. And on that level, I would think that at least any form of anarchism that I would be interested in would accept certain forms of religion, because again, if the religion's primary purposes, if this is very important, if a religion's primary purposes are to teach people how to get along, teach people how to live in place, and to teach people how to experience the divine, if it's to provide avenues for each of those three, those are all necessary for communities to persist. And by experience the divine, it doesn't have to mean capital G God. It can simply be how to experience the wonderful and beautiful mystery that is existence itself, and to experience awe. And so under those definitions, I don't have a problem with religion. Under the notions of, I was just talking with somebody yesterday, and I don't agree with this definition, but I thought it was interesting. They said that just like people say that a language is a dialect with an army, which I thought was interesting. I hadn't heard that before. They also said then they thought that a religion is a cult with a state. And if you define religion that way, I can see why there would be opposition to it. I'm not sure I agree with that definition, so then I'm not sure that I am opposed to all forms of religion.
When I started studying philosophy, I wasn't yet a religious man. I wouldn't even say today that I'm a good Catholic. Yet, what drove me towards religion was my frustration in philosophical debates, where we would use odds instead of uh, ISIS, for example. And what struck me when we debated about ethics, for example, is that we basically, even if you take Kant into consideration and other concepts of morality, we don't have any basis for our odds. And when we say religion should teach us about how to get along, for example, this frame implies that we will use some odds, if you understand me, in the sense that we religion would then go and say you should do this and this to your fellow man, or you should do this and this to your fellow animal, or uh, fellow living being, for example. Um, where, in your opinion, and in your experience, um, would we or could we get this odds if there's no religion, for example? Where does, for example, anarchism derives its odds, its beliefs of what it should be done, for example, without some, at least some, to some extent, getting into gnosis and mysticism and so forth?
Well, see, I think what you just said is really important, and that's part of my problem with this whole the side of anarchism that is frankly winning these days, and also I find particularly harmful, is on one level they argue that there should be no oughts, and that's how you end up with, as I said before, a lot of support for pedophilia within certain parts of anarchism, that they argue that there must be no oughts. And I find that position sociopathological and morally abhorrent. And in fact, there are a lot of anarchists who argue against morality, which again I find repugnant. I can see arguing against a particular morality because within, I mean, we can find any group of people who, we haven't talked about this, but it's something I've talked about a lot, that Robert J. Lifton wrote about how before you can commit any mass atrocity, you have to convince yourself and others that what you're doing is in fact good. And so, to take obvious examples, the example that he was developing that from was that the Nazis weren't committing mass murder and genocide, they were purifying the Aryan race. And of course they're committing mass murder and genocide, but they have themselves convinced that they're doing this good and difficult thing. Or, or capitalists aren't destroying the planet, they're developing natural resources. And it's the same on a personal level. I mean, I don't know about you, but never once in my life have I been a jerk. By which I mean that every time I have objectively been a jerk, I've had it fully rationalized. We are extraordinary at rationalizing our behavior. So I can understand attacking certain moralities that you find abhorrent, but the notion to do away with all morality whatsoever, whom does that serve? Whom that serves is sociopaths. Anyway, back to your question. Can you ask your question again? Because I seem to have wandered into a thicket.
Maybe it seems to me that this moral relativism, moral nihilism on some of the anarchists' part seems to be derived out of the Euthyphro dilemma. In this, you'd ask yourself this question: is something good because gods want it, or do gods want it because it's good? And then they would say this dilemma is just too hard to, it's insolvable, for example. And then they would be confessional religions, such as Judaism, Christianity, Islam. They would have their holy books, out of which they would derive some of their odds, although not all of them. And they would say, yeah, we don't have this dilemma because we know everything that's good for us is good because our God says so. For example, and if you take that away, so if you take Christianity, Judaism, Islam away, these confessional religions, then we seem to truly be lost in the pond of Euthyphro dilemma. Do you yourself have any solution to this dilemma?
Well, I
Because
think
it's easy to criticize the nihilist and more relativist, and I've been very fond of criticizing them. Yet I also found out that it's I haven't been always fair to them, at least not intellectually fully honest when criticizing them. What's your experience with?
okay. So decades ago, I was having dinner with this woman who was dating a philosophy grad student and therefore had gone temporarily insane. And what I mean by that is that during dinner, and if worse, she was dating a postmodern philosophy grad student. And during dinner, somehow the topic of rape came up, and I said something about rape being bad, and she interrupted me and said, "No, we can say that rape is bad, but we believe rape is bad because of the stories that we tell each other, and rape is not inherently bad because nothing is inherently good or bad." And I mean, you know exactly where this goes.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm going to step away from that for a second and say, when I used to teach at a university back in the 90s, I had an office for a while next door to a philosophy professor's office who said the same sort of crap all the time. He would say that whales have no inherent value, and they only have value because humans assign value to them. And I would just leave the room in frustration. But what I always wanted to do was to take a hammer and to smash his thumb with the hammer and say, you having your hand not smashed by a hammer has inherent value. No matter what anybody says, it is inherently a better thing to not have your hand smashed with a hammer than it is to have your hand smashed with a hammer. Anyway, so I didn't know how to respond to that woman at dinner that evening. And then I interviewed somebody named Charlene Spretnak who helped me understand it. And then the next time I had dinner with that woman, I said, I have an answer for you, which is, and I held up the glass of water. And I said, water is necessary because without it, you die. And so drinkable quantities of clean water are good, no matter what stories you tell. And we can build our entire morality around that. And So somebody just said on the chat that they take Sam Harris's position that the best description of good would be that which increases human well-being, and I agree with some of that, but I'm going to tweak it a bit. And the way I'm going to tweak it is that humans aren't the only ones who exist. And so I would say that healthy land bases can be, and healthy human and non-human interactions with those land bases can be a basis for our morality, that something is good. It's basically Aldo Leopold, that something is good if it strengthens the beauty and integrity of the land base upon which all life, human and non-human, is based. And so my point, going back to rape, is that I know people, mainly women, but some men, whose development has been harmed, twisted, who have not been able to fully manifest who they were as adults. Were not able to manifest who they could have been because of the trauma. But sorry if we're getting too much into thickets here, but then, sometimes people can be walking through a forest and all of a sudden a tree falls over and hits them on the head and they don't develop. But does that mean that the tree falling was an immoral thing? No, of course not. And the point here is, I love the line. Sorry if we're getting too far afield, but I love the line. No. I love the line by the mushroom guy, mycelium running. Anyway, I can't remember his name right now. He says nature loves a community. So the morality, I would build a morality, whether or not we have God, however you define that. I would say that we can base a morality on clean water and on the health, which now we would have to define health, but on the health and long-term viability of the human community embedded in the natural world. And because it can't simply be years ago, back in the 90s also, I started to read a book by Deepak Chopra. I literally didn't get past the first page because on the first page he said, death is the enemy. I was like, no, we all die. Death is the price we pay for having been born. Paul Stamets, thank you for that. Death is the price we pay for having been born. That's the admission ticket to get into this wonderful party called life. So death isn't the problem. The problem, obviously, is how we live. I don't know if that answered your question at all, but I think we can. I want to bring one more thing into this, which is Joseph Campbell in his book, Hero with a Thousand Faces, talked about how for those in whom a local mythology works, there exists a sense of accord with the universe and a sense of meaning. So if you believe in Catholicism, and this is just value neutral, if you believe in Catholicism, if the rituals work for you, then you have a path of meaning set out before you, and the universe can make sense. Or the same would be true for if capitalism makes sense for you, or if Islam makes sense for you. If some larger set of myths, if scientific materialism makes sense for you, there is some sense of meaning and sense of connection. But if those don't work for you, then you have a sense of disconnection from them, and you set out on what Joseph Campbell called the hero journey, which is where you have to try to find meaning in the world. You have to go out and find what does work for you. And this is one of the things I think is really that has been happening. I thought he was really brilliant. He wrote this in the 40s or 50s, and as there has been a dramatic shakeup of the world since the so-called Enlightenment, and a shakeup of worldviews. And then through the 20th century, there have been even more dramatic break aparts with the onslaught of technology, with the changing of what it is to be a human, to and our embeddedness in these technologies. Those have all had dramatic shifts, and I think have created a lot of people searching for answers. And when we search for answers, a lot of our answers are going to be, frankly, pretty stupid. And this is true personally as well as socially, which is how we can end up with such complete insanity as postmodernism or queer theory or any of those, is that people are searching, trying to make some new structures. Because I think the person I was interviewing yesterday, or was interviewing me yesterday, she said, I believe this, that we have a religious impulse that is, she said, just as strong as the impulse for procreation. And I think we have this need. We are inherently social creatures who were embedded in larger structures, both human and non-human. You know, I'm going to write a book about this in a couple of years. That when I finish the book I'm working on now, the next book I write is going to be about my mom's death. My mom died of cancer 3 years ago, and I was her sole caretaker as she was dying. And I encountered so many people who were the sole caretakers of their dying parents, and it destroys it destroys you to do it by yourself. And humans didn't evolve to do things like that by ourselves. We evolved to do them in a community. And we are so messed up that way. This was the first, my grandma died 30 years ago, and I've had some like distant friends die, but this is the first really, really close person I've had die. And I was 58 years old, and in a functioning community of 120 people. By then I would have experienced the deaths of probably 50, 60 people. By the time I get to be 58, I should have experienced death of 50, 60, 70 people who were all close to me. That should be a part of our yearly existence. And we're so disconnected from all of those things. And I think, to go back to the original point, I think that there is a profound need to reconnect to some community. And we're ending up with all sorts of toxic mimics, like online communities, or online communities in quotes, and a relationship to, and relationships to machines instead of relationships to non-humans. Or, it's extraordinary. I'm guessing this is true for most of the people listening to this too, that I realized suddenly about 20 years ago, and this is horrifying, that I touch plastic, like keyboards. I touch plastic more than I touch flesh. That's utterly horrifying. Anyway, so back, I don't know where the hell I'm going with that. So ask me a question to bring me back.
Yeah, I know what you're saying, because my best friend had this experience this year. He had his mother dying, and then he was the only that could take care of her up till the end, and it really changed him physically and psychologically, and it was a great burden, to the extent that I know it sounds horrible, but at the end he was almost relieved when his mother died, because of the burden this presented to him.
I know I'm going to write about that in the book, that it's the same thing. I loved and love my mother very much. And there were times, okay, so only after she entered terminal delirium was I able to bring in, then I started paying people from a church, and to come in to like lie with her on her bed so that I could go to sleep. And only when they came in was I able to do what I should have been doing all along, which is to be able to love her into her death. But up until then, I was just running myself ragged. And yes, it's like, can this nightmare just end? And I mean, I'm not it wasn't my mom who was the nightmare. It's that process
Of course.
that is just impossible for an individual. So the
Um,
point is, we're not meant to do all this stuff by ourselves.
this is an important question, I believe, because I come from the I used to be a left winger, but not a very articulate one when I was 20 years old. Perhaps it was very vague and so forth. But then when I started developing as a thinker, as a political philosophical thinker, I almost immediately became some sort of right winger, and I went through many phases. And one of the phases was also so-called anarchical capitalism, which is a phase I of course, am not very fond of today. But do you know anything of anarchical capitalism? And in which sense do you think it's similar, and in which sense it is different than anarchism um, as um, as a concept, as more of a left-wing concept, if I may say so?
I don't know a lot about anarcho-capitalism. What little I know, and this may be misrepresenting it, is that it seems that it's basically just libertarian capitalism. But that's just off the cuff take. I don't know much about it.
Do you think it's counterintuitive, anarcho-capitalism, at least from the point of view? Um, how do you define capitalism? You're not fond of capitalism, I believe, and you're a critic of capitalism.
Well, it depends what you want. It's really good at making it so that I can go to Walmart at 2 a.m. and buy a garden hose. And is it good at maintaining the ecological integrity of the planet? No. Is it very good at promoting community self-sufficiency? No. It's very interesting. So the book I have a book coming out next spring that is that's about the legalization of marijuana. And the approach I take on, I live in marijuana country. I live in far northern California. And the approach I take in the book is that marijuana legalization has been basically a transfer of wealth away from family farmers to large capitalist interests. And the reason is that, interestingly enough, illegality created barriers to economies of scale, that you can run some little grow house in your spare bedroom, but there's no way you could have an entire city block of greenhouses without being caught. And now the way legality has been done, there has been such a concentration of ownership that the family farmers are going out of business. And in Colorado, 4 economic entities control basically all of the marijuana trade now. So my point is that this is a great example of what has happened over and over under a oligopolistic capitalist system, that there is pretty consistent consolidation, and this is a pattern we've seen again and again, pretty consistent consolidation of means of production, consolidation of means of transportation, et cetera, et cetera. Oh, and so far as whether I'm a critic of capitalism, it is just the latest form of what's been going on since the start of civilization, which is the conversion of the living planet into human artifacts. So it's just one manifestation. And it's really good at that. If that is one's goal, then it is a fine way to do it. If one's goal is something else, then it's not so delightful.
I know the so-called mainstream right in America has been now for 30 years, maybe even more, considered this practically libertarian or neoliberal or whatever you'd call it. So nowadays, even Slovene right wingers, when you ask them what the true right wing is, they would say true right wing is for small state, lower taxes, and so forth. And there's been this clash on the right wing between sovereignists and globalists. That would be the globalists would be for this neoliberalism and this capitalism we spoke about, and sovereignists would be against it. And in this context, this question seems meaningful. At least, do ethnic groups, at least for Europe, I know that this is probably more problematic for America, because America is not anymore as homogeneous as it used to be, or if it ever was, as European nation states. Do ethnic groups have inherent value, or could they be considered in this way? If yes, does that value come from the fact that they are different and unique, or simply because they belong to the living beings category?
Well, I think that's a really important question. And I want to back up a second. And when you said that the right is divided over globalism versus sovereign states, that's something I've done a couple interviews where I've interviewed people about, especially Diana Johnstone, basically old school commie, old school lefty. And the reason the second interview I did with her was because I don't understand dogmatic left-wing support for the EU. It makes absolutely no sense to me. I don't understand how the left has been captured by globalism. Because at one point, not even very long ago, 25 years ago, the left was absolutely opposed to globalism. And the left was rioting against globalism and was all about relocalizing as much as possible. And that's frankly a place where I think the left and right, maybe old school lefties and old school right wingers should actually come together, is in a belief in the importance of local governance. It blows me away and kind of cracks me up when you see like anarchists arguing for, when you see lefties, oh, I don't even want to get into this morass. It's like these days it is a dogma of the left that you have to be for absolutely open borders. And traditionally, you go back 50, 80 years, it was the capitalists who wanted open borders, and it was the lefties who wanted, the labor who wanted not open borders. And I don't really understand how that conversion's taken place. Anyway, now to the question about ethnic groups. Absolutely, positively, they have inherent value. And I find it horrifying. I find it horrifying if I see a news report out of Botswana and I see people wearing ties and I see them driving Toyotas. because all of that has to, and speaking English, because people ask me what sort of culture I want to have replace this culture. When I talk about I want civilization to end, what I want is for 10,000 cultures to replace this culture, each one arising from its own land base. This is a problem I have with global religions too, is that we talked about religion earlier, and part of the job of a religion is, I think, to teach you how to live in place, like I said, and it's also how to teach you to experience the divine. But honestly, living in place is going to be much different in the desert than it will be in a rainforest. And experiencing the divine will be much different in a desert than a rainforest. And Thunderstruck just said, can you put that back up? The left wants, that's actually queer theory, and that's a postmodern left. And some of the left wants to do that, and there is some of the left who doesn't want to do that. And so yes, I agree with you that much of the left wants to do that, which is one reason so many lefties, the most common thing I hear old school lefties say at this point is that they feel politically homeless because the left has completely lost its mind. Anyway, back to the original point. I think that ethnicities and local dialects and local languages absolutely have great value. And I am almost as horrified by the loss of human languages and language diversity as I am the loss of biodiversity. Not quite, but almost. And so, yes, I think, I've said this several times now, but yes, local ethnicities have tremendous inherent value. And I am such a firm believer in localities maintaining some form of traditional integrity.
Yeah, we Slovenes have this interesting anecdote about our lives, about our history. For example, we didn't want to get into communistic Yugoslavia, but we stayed for 50 years there, and then in the beginning of the 90s, we were fooled into Euro-Atlanticism, which is basically globalism. And this, while we were always scared about communism, that communism wanted to make this merger between Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, and they would plan mixed marriages and so forth. The interesting fact is that in 50 years of Yugoslavia, Slovenes basically remained 80 till 90% of a majority in their republic, which then got independent. And since the 91, since our independence, it seems that there's not even 50% of Slovenes in Slovenia anymore. So capitalism, we're not even allowed to measure ourselves according to two criteria that was possible in communist Yugoslavia, according to criteria of ethnicity and religiosity, because our rulers, our right-wing or globalist rulers, know that it would show the catastrophic result. Yeah, this is what did the what would be your comment on this?
I mean, obviously, you would know it much better than I. I just was introduced to that fact that you said right then, and I find it. Okay, here's what I think. I think that, yeah, the problem isn't, I don't think the problem is capitalism or communism, or I think the problem actually is globalism. I think that is a, and I'm not saying that nobody can ever go any other place. I'm not saying that nobody should be able to move from Burundi to Crescent City, where I live. I'm not saying that at all. What I'm saying is that
indigenous people should be able to have something to say about it. Would you say that?
Oh, yeah. In fact, I remember reading an American Indian guy, oh, this is maybe 8 months ago. He was just laughing when people talk about when lefties use indigenous people to argue for open borders. Because he said, you know what we did to people who came into our land without us asking? We killed them. And that's,
precisely.
and I'm not suggesting that as a solution, by the way. I was interviewed by somebody, and the lefties got really mad at me for this. I was interviewed by some guy who he was a white supremacist. I didn't know that going in, and or a white nationalist, I guess. And he asked me about immigration, and I said, "Look, immigration based on global warming, refugees." No, actually, it was just immigration. And I said, "Look, I'm going to say something that's going to make the left wing people mad. I'm going to say something that's going to make the right wing people mad. The right wing people are going to get mad because a lot of the people who are coming to the United States from, say, Central America, they're coming because global capitalists have destroyed their communities. They're not coming for fun. They're not coming because they want to. They're coming because Dole Banana Company has stolen their land to grow bananas so you can eat them, in the middle of New York City. So that's going to make the right wing people mad that I'm blaming capitalism for this influx of refugees. And then what's going to make the left wing people mad is I also understand when you live in a neighborhood and all of a sudden a new person moves in, you look at them askance, and it doesn't even matter what color they are. It doesn't matter. When I moved into this neighborhood, the neighbors were worried about me until they learned I was an okay person. And whenever a new person, I mean, this is true with non-humans. If you have two dogs in your house and you bring in another dog, for a while they don't really like each other oftentimes. And so I understand if you have a community and a bunch of people are coming into your community, and maybe these people speak a different language, maybe these people have different customs. I'm not saying that they're bad people. I'm saying that I understand also why the people in the community would be concerned about an influx of new people. And this is true. I don't care what color you are. I don't care what the ethnicity is. If you have a whole bunch of people from Slovenia, if you have 500 people from Slovenia suddenly move into, or you have 50 people from Slovenia suddenly move into a village of 100 people in Botswana, the local people in Botswana are going to go, God, that's weird. I mean, they're going to look askance at that, and I think that's completely natural, and it's something that we shouldn't just call them bad people for feeling weird about it. Am I making sense?
Yeah, of course, you're making sense. Um, what I also wanted to ask, and this would be my last question because it's getting late here, and you're probably also tired. You have some other things to do. I wanted to ask you about that video that went viral when you lectured about queer theory, and students really attacked you about queer theory. What would you say are the pluses and what are the minuses besides this inclination towards pedophilia? And what would you say? Why did it take this inclination on one point?
Well, I'm going to back up a little bit, and I think sometimes humans have a tendency to come up with stupid answers to good questions. I don't know why. But postmodernism is a really great example of that, where it started with a really great question, which is, what do we do with the fact that we don't, that our perceptions of reality are affected by our preconceptions? And what do we do with the fact that different people perceive stories differently, and then these narratives can sort of compete, and one narrative will win out over another? So some people can perceive Christopher Columbus as a wonderful, brave explorer, and other people perceive him as a genocidal enslaver. And what do we do with the fact that these narratives, sometimes one narrative will come to dominate society and sometimes another narrative will come to dominate society? Beautiful question, important question. And what do we do with, I'm sure that there are local, we could talk about, the EU. What do we do with, some people think that the EU is a great thing for human rights. Other people think that EU is a terrible thing for human rights, community rights. And all those narratives are competing. And postmodernism comes up with the stupidest answer possible, which is, there is no reality underlying the narratives. There's only the narratives. That's the stupidest possible response. The real response is, our perceptions are colored by our preconceptions. Duh. Anyway, so queer theory starts with a great question. This is the only good thing I can say about queer theory. It starts with a great question, which is, why is it that some forms of sexuality have been traditionally prohibited or traditionally discouraged? And I think it's a great question. I think it's a really important question. But their answer is the stupidest one possible, which is, because homosexuality has been proscribed and there is no good moral reason to prescribe homosexuality, therefore all prescriptions against all forms of sexuality are inherently oppressive. Well, that's just stupid. And we can talk about it, why that's stupid and how that's stupid if you want, but basically it has been, from the beginning, I'm going to get in trouble for this, but I don't care, that queer theory has basically been about a fetishistic rights movement. And one reason I feel really comfortable saying that is because queer theory has been opposed from the beginning, from 1980. It has been opposed by a lot of really smart gays and especially lesbians who say, look, we just want to love whomever we want. That doesn't mean we think it's okay to screw dogs. And we don't think that means it's okay to torture people under the name of sex. There's this idea in queer theory that so long as somebody has an orgasm, nobody gets to question it. And that's absurd. We should be able to discuss the social and personal benefits and harms of any action whatsoever, whether that action involves an orgasm or not. We should be able to ask ourselves and discuss publicly whether we think it is good for society and good for individuals to shop at Walmart. We think we should be able to ask, is it good for individuals and for society for people to drive cars? I think it should be acceptable for people to ask, is it socially acceptable? Is it socially and personally beneficial to have somebody have an orgasm while they are choking a woman into unconsciousness? I think that we need to ask just because he had an orgasm does not mean that we don't get to ask whether that's socially and personally beneficial. And that's a real example that just happened. There's a baseball player in the National League, in the Major League Baseball, who currently is being investigated by the cops because there was a groupie and he choked her out during sex and also beat her up during sex. And he said it was all consensual. And so somehow, fortunately, there are people who don't agree with this, but queer theorists would argue it's none of anybody's business. And so queer theory's idea is that, so, okay, here's the thing, is that certain classes of people oppress certain other classes of people. And within patriarchy, men oppress women, and the solution from queer theory is not to deal with the fact that this material reality creates this oppression, to deal with the oppression, but to pretend that those classes don't exist. And this goes back to the ethnicity question too, that my problem is not that different ethnicities exist, because I think that ethnicities should be valued. The problem is when you say that they are inferior and superior, that because this person is of this ethnicity, that means that I'm better than they are and I need to enslave them. That's the problem. The problem isn't the existence of different ethnicities, just like the problem isn't the difference in that men and women exist. And so it takes us down into a huge rat hole that is, I think, just utter nonsense. And I don't know, even though I've been working on these issues for years, I don't understand how people can say with a straight face that sex is a social construct. It's like, do you really not know where babies come from? And if sex is a social construct, does that mean that Tyrannosaurus Rexes didn't know how to make babies themselves? Was sex a social construct for them too? And I completely agree with what Thunderstruck just said, that they're pushing hard on pedophilia, and they've been pushing hard on pedophilia for a while. And this is one thing, and this is one of many hills I will die on. I will not. I mean, I will oppose the left as long as it supports pedophilia, and I will oppose anarchism as long as it supports pedophilia.
I like one last question, although it is a complex one and a complex topic at that. About modern day. Wait a minute. Okay. On one hand, you probably are not a global warming denialist. You say that the global warming exists, but on the other hand, I heard you in some interviews being very critical about what the solutions proposed are. You've been critical towards the solutions that I don't know, the globalists, the mainstream left, the guys, or the whole show around Greta Thunberg proposed. Am I right, or am I wrong about what I just said?
Well, let's leave Greta Thunberg out of it, because I don't want to. I think it's wonderful that a young person is so dedicated to, frankly, any cause, and she's not the problem.
Okay.
So let's leave her out of it. But leaving her out of it, yes, the solutions proposed don't do anything to help the planet. In fact, they harm the planet. A bunch of reasons. One, like solar, wind, all of those, what they are is they're about bringing new energy sources online. They have nothing to do with helping the planet. And they don't even replace fossil fuels. There's something called Jevons paradox, which is really interesting. I mean, there's other problems with them too, but I'm just going to go here for now. Jevons paradox is that Jevons was an economist in the 19th century who studied coal use. And he wanted to figure out if increased efficiency in coal use would decrease coal use. You'd think it would, because if you can heat your dinner with half as much coal, you only have to make half as much coal. Or if you can heat your house with half as much coal, you only use half as much coal. But what he found is that increased efficiency in coal use increased demand for coal because you found new uses for it, new economical uses for it. And if you're a business and coal is one of your big costs, and suddenly the price of coal drops in half, or suddenly you use it twice as efficiently, what you're going to do is you're going to expand your business. And so you have the same coal expenses, but now you're using more coal, and you're also using more of other materials. So this has happened with every energy form, that for a long time humans used wood, and then after that they started using coal, and coal use just simply added on top of wood. And then after that they started using oil, and that just added on top. And then after that they started using hydro or nuclear, and those just added on top. All of these new energy sources simply add on top of the old ones. And the same is true for other materials too. If you find ways to use copper more efficiently, they just use more copper. So all of this is a big con game and has nothing to do with the natural world. So no, I'm not a global warming denier at all. Global warming is terrifying. The solutions we present are reforestation, allowing prairies to come back, allowing peat bogs to come back, salt marshes to come back, allowing the world to heal, which ain't gonna happen under globalism.
Okay, Derek. We've been almost hour and a half here now. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your answers. Thank you for your thoughtfulness. I really appreciated that you accepted my invitation. I hope we can do another stream some other time after a while.
That would be great. And thank you for your great questions, and thank you for people for their comments too. That was great.
Thanks to all the people that commented. Thank you all. Good evening, good afternoon, good night, wherever you are. And that was all.
Talk to you soon.
Bye. Talk to you soon.